I was just going to say, you know, just for contextualization, that it's been especially relevant to this first question, is that it's been, you know, almost, well, about 30 years since we first began to put together a proposal to edit the journal. So in terms of what led us to do that, it's been a long time, so I'm not sure I'm accurate in responding to that. But we, you know, we basically felt we had, and I should say this is Carolyn Allen, who, as I mentioned in my email, passed away. We have been very close colleagues from when I came to the University of Washington in 1982. And, you know, by then there was a very strong feminist community at the UW. There had been, we were one of the very early women's studies departments in the country, but, you know, it was a very small unit, as most of them were in those early years. But by the time, you know, we began to talk about possibly putting together a proposal in the mid to late 90s, you know, we felt like we had a very strong and broad feminist community, both at the university, but also in the Seattle area more generally, and that it was worth a shot. You know, it's a journal that we both read and respected very highly. And I'm trying to remember, I may have spoken with Barbara Laslett about it, who was part of the editorial team before us, because she's a sociologist as well as I am. And so I think I may have spoken with her about it. I'm not entirely sure, but basically it was that we felt we had a good and broad feminist community here, and that it was worth exploring. Both Carolyn and I have been involved with journals in our own disciplines prior to this. So we'd had, you know, some experience with serving as deputy and associate editors and so forth. So. No, in many ways, I think that is the most central question, and certainly the most significant consequence of having the journal here. You know, and thinking about what difference it made to have it here, I think it was huge. We involved a number of both more senior and more up and coming scholars, and also some graduate students. So we really tried to make it as broad as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of, they're no longer called community colleges, but they were at the time in the area where we had some, you know, former graduates who were teaching, and just tried to bring in as broad a constituency as we possibly could. And with the journal, I think it did a huge amount to deepen and broaden the feminist community here, and also to create a sense of a strong feminist community among those who would not have considered themselves part of it on campus as a whole. You know, one of the really critical things, I talk more about this in a little bit, but was getting support from the administration to do this and to get some space. One of Carolyn's former chairs, Dick Dunn, happened to be our divisional dean of humanities at the time, and we approached him about space for the journal, and he agreed to give us a certain space that we are to this day confident he never went and looked at it, because it turned out to be just a spectacular and much larger space than we'd ever imagined, with kitchen facilities and meeting spaces. And it was like, what it had been was the former honors space, basically, and they had just moved to a new location. And it was fantastic, and it allowed us to do, you know, events and bring groups in and so forth that we would never have been able to do with just an office for a managing editor or something like that. But I think more generally, you know, chairs of a number of different departments, deans, associate deans, and whatever, became more aware of the feminist community on campus because we had the journal, and that felt like a huge thing. You know, one of the things that's very relevant here is that the University of Chicago is an extremely highly respected press, as you well know. And I think there were people who weren't aware of the journal who were like, "Oh, the University of Chicago," and you know, that even just that recognition generated some respect, but also because it's a press that provides, and I don't know if this is still true, but it provided vastly more support for the journal and the journal offices than many, you know, presses do, and that made a big difference. But I definitely think that having it here and having a lot of respected scholars involved with the journal definitely created more awareness of feminist scholarship and its importance. First, we'll go to something you've already highlighted, which is the sense of community. Again, with the resources that Chicago provided, we were able to have Basically community lunches or events from time to time, and just bring people together, not necessarily to talk about the journal specifically, but just as a community building thing. And it made a huge difference. And it also deepened our connections to some of the other campuses in the Seattle area, which was a very important thing to be doing as well. But just the gatherings were fun. One thing that you may not know, the design with the hanging S on the cover of Signs was
Yes.
something that we instituted. But we felt like the previous design, and it just seemed boring, and we decided we wanted to change it. And the whole process of getting ideas of what some alternatives might be and who to involve in that and how to evaluate them, because neither of us had any particular design sense or anything like that, was really fascinating. What that also led to, and this was clearly something was very energizing and a lot of fun, was choosing for every issue what image were we going to have on the cover. I'm looking at several of them over here now, and that was, we'd have any number of submissions for every issue, and really be talking about what did we want to emphasize, whose work, and it was really, they were very nuanced conversations among our staff and editorial board and so forth, and our advisory board, and that was a very instructive process, actually. So that was good, but it was really community more than anything that I remember most fondly. That's a complicated question for me. When Science left, I became the chair of what was then Women's Studies and is now Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and left from that position to become a divisional dean of social sciences, which is a position I held until I retired. So it would be fair to say that from pretty much the point I stopped editing the journal, I was doing administration. And clearly I was continuing to do scholarship, but more often in collaboration with my graduate students. And I would certainly say that editing Signs, it introduced me to some fields I didn't know much about. It certainly, it just broadened my whole sense about how do we even evaluate scholarship, it broadened it considerably. And I know that had an influence on my own work, but my own scholarly career got shifted in some pretty significant ways because of my administrative responsibilities after that. I have always had a very significant interest in pedagogy and had taught a teaching seminar for a long time. And I know that much of what happened with Signs influenced that. I can say more about that later, but it's suffice it to say, I was introduced to a number of fields I did not know much about, and that certainly broadened my own scholarly reach, but that my career got sort of moved in different directions because of the administrative responsibilities. That's a very critical question. I don't know what you're going to think about my answer, but in some ways, I think many of the critical questions then remain the critical questions today. You asked, maybe this is something you're going to ask about a little bit later, but an article that made a particularly significant impact. In looking back at the various things we did, I think our millennial issue was the one that I thought was the most significant. I've just been rereading our introduction for that special issue, which, of course, came at the end of our editorship. I've been very struck in reading through it that I think the same issues we raised there are the issues today. I think there's much more awareness of the importance of looking at feminisms in a global context. I mean, it was an issue then, but I think we're vastly more successful with it now. But the struggles then, I think, remain the struggles today, and in some ways, as you know from the political environment we're working in, almost more challenging. What it feels like, and abortion is a prime example of that, is that there have been times in our respective political histories where I think there was an overly too much emphasis on progress and progress and progress, and not enough recognition that progress can always be overturned, and that in some sense the struggles have to be continual because there's always going to be countervailing trends. And I think certainly, I'm an early baby boomer, and certainly there was a sense at a time earlier in my own life that progress was going to just continue and we'd be moving in better and better directions. And that feels very naive right now. And so I think the fact that we have some of the same issues now, same struggles now, doesn't make me in any way give up hope, but it really speaks to the importance of um, trying to avoid sliding back, of really trying to educate, broad communities as best we can. Um, of always knowing things can change again. Certainly one of the big issues that's much too sophomoric a way to put it, but that some of the really important struggles when we were editing Science, and even before as we were thinking about bringing the journal, was that I think at that point, women's studies departments in particular had not at all been successful in bringing feminists of color into the journal,
Yeah.
into the academy, and to so forth. And I think that has changed dramatically, that has been an incredibly important direction of growth. But that doesn't mean that the world as a whole recognizes that importance. I've thought about that, and not really. I mean, we 5 years worth of issues, and there were lots of essays that felt significant. But I do think the millennial issue is, in many ways, the most significant. Of course, it's a different focus in that there were a lot of shorter essays, but on many different topics. So in terms of sort of looking at the whole terrain of feminist scholarship, I think that issue did that more than any other. We had another collection called Provoking Feminisms, where we took some of the special forums that we had convened over the years and invited people to comment on those. And I think that was another important contribution. But I continue to think the millennial issue was really, it was a unique opportunity, obviously, and one that I think I was pleased with how it came together. I can't recall anything like that, and that may just be, that one tends to remember the better things than the worst. But I don't really think there was anything like that. I mean, Carolyn and I, we were very different people, and I think in that sense, a very effective editorial team. That Carolyn, of course, was in English and literary criticism and so forth, and I'm in sociology, so our fields were different. But we also had very different personal styles. Well, I tend to be a very type A, and she's a different type. I guess we're both type A's, but different types. Where I'm tend to be the one that kind of keeps an office, tidy and motivated and so forth. And she would be really exploring issues sometimes exploring issues to a greater length or depth than I might think we had time for. But we just had different styles, and I think that actually was really good, both for the personal relationships of the office and our outreach to very different communities of feminist scholars, given our respective scholarly fields. But I don't recall anything that was really something there was profound regret about. Yeah, I think it's actually been profound changes, and I was glad to see that you were asking about that. And in some ways, I think I probably have a better purchase on that for my position as divisional dean than I did through editing the journal or through serving as the chair of the department. The fact that I was even asked to serve as a divisional dean, coming as at that point as the chair of what was then Women's Studies, was unusual. And I think there are a number of things that followed from that, one of which was that I clearly really valued academic publishing. And so when faculty would come to the dean's office and want support for editorial offices, I was always the one most inclined to say, yeah, we really need to move forward with this. But I definitely think there have been some major changes. And more than anything else, it's what Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies is called here, GWSS. A lot of my colleagues call it Gee Whiz, and I've always thought that was a diminishing name, and I will not use it. So I'm going to be referring to it as GWSS. But that it is in a very central position now in the college. We have done some very significant hiring. We have had one of the earliest doctoral programs that began in '97. that now most of the faculty that are in these departments have degrees in feminist studies, not in disciplines where they're sort of having to reorient their perspectives. And I think it has really become, I may be overly focused on my own institution, but I think this is truer more generally, that it's moved into a much different position of respect of people looking to the field to raise significant questions and offer significant responses and approaches. It's been the one to model, together with ethnic studies and indigenous studies, to model ways of really bringing different fields together in constructive and forward-looking, directions. And I think it's done a better job with that than most. And I do think there's been very, very significant changes in that regard. I think in some ways the obvious answer to that is a sort of mundane one, which is, I wish that respect were accompanied with resources.
Mhm.
I have spent my entire career at public institutions, and resources are always scarce. That's why the University of Chicago was such a great publisher for us, because it provided resources the institution didn't. But I'm sure there are things that I could come up with, but I'm not really recognizing anything that would be frustrating or that I'd be concerned about. I think obviously hiring is always a really huge issue, and different institutions have their own histories and track records, but overall, it has felt to me that the job market in the field has been at least as good as in many other fields, and better than some. I don't know how, what this is like at other institutions, but I've actually been very pleased at responses by our central administration to retention situations for a number of feminist scholars, not just in GWSS, but in other fields, and really recognizing, and of course, that's obviously an ongoing challenge, but recognizing the importance of these scholars, and have come up with the resources necessary to retain them. I guess what I would say is, more than anything else, I mean, in some ways, the obvious answer is whoever steps in to be the next editorial office. I think it's absolutely critical, and this goes back to what our motivation was, to have a broad field available at their own institution, and perhaps in other ways as well, but certainly at their own institution, of support and commitment of people who will be interested in doing this and will be strong advocates for it. And by that, I mean both faculty and also administration. I think there are many institutions now that really, have lost interest in scholarly publishing. I don't think scholarly publishing is going to go away, but its forms will be changing dramatically. Just one tiny example, the short takes element of Signs now, I think, was a wonderful addition, and things that begin to draw in not just subscribers, but a broader community of people that might be interested in these things are important. Just as one example, and in a funny way, maybe short takes is, well, it's not exactly the same thing, but sort of like something that happened at the ASA, the American Sociological Association, instituted, gosh, well, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago, as a journal called Contexts, which takes significant sociological work and has the authors put that into a form that might be more readable by a general public, an informed general public. And that gets published, I think, 4 times a year now. And you can use it in classrooms. And the original goal when that journal was created was to actually speak to a public outside the academy. In fact, that's not who uses it. It's mostly sociologists who use it for the classroom in ways that they would not necessarily, at least for some undergraduate courses, for the regular articles. But I think things, and Science is clearly already well aware of this, that speak beyond the academy, that speak to a general public who will be interested in the issues that Science cares about, of finding more ways to do that. But you think about the ways in which social media has just transformed conversations. I don't know how that's going to intersect in the future with scholarly publishing, but it seems absolutely critical that any future editorial office be thinking really hard about that. it feels really daunting to me right now because of all the changes that you just identified very articulately. Very daunting to think about taking on the next 25 years of science. I think when I look at some of our younger scholars just in our own UW GWSS department, they know that terrain vastly better than some of those of us who are more senior do, and they'll have ideas that I would never have thought of. There are a couple of other things that I've been thinking about, and some of this goes back really to the influence of women's studies as a field of gender studies, and thinking about things that matter in the academy more generally. I think something that has never gotten enough attention is the ways in which feminists transformed what good pedagogy is and have never gotten credit for it institutionally. And I think many of the things are just regarded as best practices in pedagogy now, or things that feminists were doing from the very beginning. People don't lecture anymore, at least it's not taken for granted. And I think participation of students in their own education, creating scholarly communities in a classroom instead of a sort of top-down approach, having space to debate things, having space to share your own work. All of these are things that are just standard feminist practice. And I think they'd be regarded by many, teaching centers now as standard practice, but they haven't always been. And feminists have never gotten credit for that. And I don't mean credit in a simplistic sort of way. I mean, recognizing that really there were some important impulses in early feminist work that were recognized as being very significant for the educational experience. The word interdisciplinarity is regarded as a positive word now. Right. It hasn't always been regarded as a positive word.
Exactly.
Feminist studies as a field, to some extent, ethnic studies as a field, were born with interdisciplinarity in a certain way, and kind of shared political investments across different disciplines that I think many administrators don't honestly understand, and really don't know how difficult it is to do it successfully. The whole, this I'm ranging afield from your questions, but the whole future of disciplines is a really interesting question now. Just as one tiny example, the ASA, which of course is the field I know the best, membership has been dropping steadily. People, and part of this, of course, is COVID, of people not wanting to come back to going to meetings on a regular basis. The questions that climate change poses to getting together in disciplinary gatherings. I mean, there's some really significant questions, some of which are well beyond the academy and some of which are not, that I don't really see anybody stepping in to address head on.
Yeah.
And in some ways, feminist studies as a field has been much more forward thinking from the outset. I mean, I think the NWSA still has, many of these issues are there for them as well, but it might do administrators some good to actually be looking at fields that have been more boundary breaking to see if there's some answers in the times ahead. I did want to mention one other thing that we did with the journal, which I don't know if all editorial offices have done this or not, but I think it actually was another instance of interdisciplinarity, is we ran a graduate seminar on feminist publishing all of the times that we were, the years that we were editing. Carolyn and I taught it, and this was one of the ways in which the institution did provide support for this, is that we each got teaching credit in our own departments for teaching this, even though it was a combined class. And we had to work out some details about that, but it was a feminist, it was a graduate seminar in feminist publishing, and we basically, science was the sort of guinea pig for the course. And what it did was to bring feminist graduate students together from a number of different departments and meet each other and begin some, lifelong collaborations have come out of that. In fact, this is somebody who went after finishing her degree in political science. She was a student of Nancy Hartsock's, went to Ohio State, and then we hired her back here a few years ago. And her partner is the editor-in-chief of the University of Washington Press, and they were both interns for Science when we had the journal here. And so things like that, I think, were really important. And they were partly just demystifying the whole process of academic publishing for our graduate students, which, I think was a useful thing to do. But other journals that have been at the UW have gone on to do that since then. But I think it was a really good thing. It's certainly something I would recommend any future editorial office to think about doing.